now. So we are streaming, we are recording, and if you want to wait a minute or two, I think that's fine. I'm just still letting a bunch of people in, but then we can get started.
Wow, nice crowd.
Mm-hmm.
Nice crowd. There's friendly faces except for one. I don't want to say who it is though. Faces.
Okay, Annie, I think if you want to get started, you should.
Okay. Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody to Wayne State University Press Zoom event for the Made in Michigan Writers Series. This is all about writing thematic collections of poetry. And I'm really excited you're all here today. Any questions you have, feel free to write them in the little chat box. And we'll get to those towards the end. And what else do I need to remind? I have a list. I've been told of things I need to remind people of. So questions, go ahead, ask them. And I won't answer them, but our great panelists will. 2, 40% off, free shipping. What? That is what Wayne State University Press is offering on any of the books or any of our other books on our website. 40% off, the code is READ. And you can get these award-winning books. And I think that's it. I just want to get into it because I want to hear from our panelists. So we've got 3 great poets with us tonight who have written fantastic books. I'm really excited to introduce you to them. One of the things for me, I'm Annie Martin, in case you don't know, I'm editor-in-chief, which is just a fancy thing for, I get to read a lot of cool books. One of the great things I get to do is read these amazing books. And the reason these 3 kind of stick out to me in so many ways of what attracted me to them is that they all showed me different worlds. Ones that aren't in my purview per se. They're not things that I experience every day, but what they were able to do was allow me to be empathetic, was allow me to gain knowledge, and gave me the opportunity to feel and be a better person, kind of. So that's what, to me, puts these at the top of my list as great collections. Our first panelist is Brian G. Gilmore. Born and raised Washington, D.C., but Michigan was lucky enough to get you. Thank you for your professional ambition. He is teaching social justice law at Michigan State, but even better than that, he is a poet. He's the author of 3 previous poetry collections, including We Didn't Know Any Gangsters, a 2014 NAACP Image Award nominee. He, like I said, currently teaches at MSU. His newest collection, I'm gonna hold it up, Come See About Me, Marvin, was named a 2020 Michigan Notable Book. But what's even better about this book is how relatable and readable this book is. Again, like I talked about, that experience that maybe I haven't had, but we've all felt like outsiders or like we haven't belonged at some point. What Brian's able to do is use Marvin Gaye as, I'll say his buddy, to get through and narrate this strange land of Michigan and how difficult the terrain can sometimes be, especially for a person of color and coming from a totally different place. So I'm really excited to hear from him about this collection. Next is Jeff Kass, Teacher Pizza Guy. Sorry to make you hungry with the cover. His book was also a 2020 Michigan Notable Book, which is really great. There's 20 books on this list. they don't choose a lot of poetry, so I get really excited when they have good taste in poetry. This is his book. Jeff makes me exhausted thinking about all the jobs he has. You do, Jeff. He is a 10th grade English and creative writing teacher at Pioneer High School. He is the founder of a literary arts program at Ann Arbor's youth organization. It's the Neutral Zone, and he was program director for 20 years there. And he's a prolific writer, short fiction, poetry, novel. He's all over the place. Award-winning, great. Teach the Pizza Guy, though, is this autobiographical collection that takes us into his world in 2016, 2017, where he's doing all of these jobs and then delivers pizzas to supplement his income, working hard for his family. And so that kind of vulnerability, again, sort of what Brian does too, Jeff brings that as well. It's really funny, but at the same time, it's vulnerable, it's scary, it's testing what it means to be a man, what it means to be a father, what it means to be a human. But not only that, in this microcosm of what he's showing us in his world, he shows a bigger thing of what is really happening in America's educational system. And so, again, it's a great book. Really excited to be talking to him today too. And our third poet is Cindy Hunter Morgan, who, HARBORLESS is her book, a 2018 Michigan Notable book. And when Cindy's not teaching, when she's not teaching creative writing and book arts at Michigan State University, her mind can be found creating these wonderful poems and this art. HARBORLESS, though, is something that was so surprising to me when I read it. I was like, shipwrecks? I'm not really into shipwrecks, like that's not my bag, but this is not just shipwrecks. This is about death, destruction, and life. And what she does is use historical angles of shipwrecks that have happened in the Great Lakes. And then she's able to take these moments, use those historical, and really give us an idea of a survivor, somebody who's lost, give us these little details of what was going on during those times. And her imagination is incredible. This is a poetry manuscript I couldn't put down. I read it in one sitting, and I think I read it again almost immediately after. It's an incredible journey, and I'm so glad to have the three of you here. So what I'd like to do is have them introduce themselves by reading a couple of poems from their collections. So I'm going to start with the lovely Jeff Kass, and teacher. No, did I say Jeff? Yeah, Jeff Kass. That's who I was going to start with, Jeff Kass. Take it away.
Thank you, Annie. And thank you everyone who came out tonight. This is really fun to see so many people here and so many students. So I'm going to read a couple poems, one longer one and one short one. So the first one is called Making the First Milkshake. And I kind of like this poem right now because it's a poem about, making a milkshake, but it's also about the kind of jobs that people are still doing that aren't necessarily like the ones who are getting clapped for at 7 o'clock at night on the streets of New York, but people are still doing these jobs, and they were doing it before the virus too, in an underappreciated way. And that's kind of like delivering pizzas, but also delivering newspapers. And most people who deliver pizzas is not their only job, right? Because you can't really make enough money just delivering pizzas. So this is kind of about camaraderie and making a friend, I guess, more than anything else. It's called Making the First Milkshake. 1. I've been warned. The other Jeff, who's my age, maybe a year or 3 older, screwed it up big time. He only drives until midnight, and then he departs to work his next job, bagging copies of the New York Times and delivering them before dawn. In fact, my house is part of his route. Twice now, I've arrived home at 5 a.m. at exactly the precise moment that he, through the passenger side window of his beat-up van, tosses our morning paper into the driveway. We are, In that moment, a fog-smudged Venn diagram of two middle-aged Jeffs colliding as we captain our weathered vessels through the sea of untime. When bedroom windows remain darkened, undergrads smoke themselves to oblivion, and traffic lights cease to function. The other Jeff is friendly and wears the kind of white hair and mustache I associate with youth baseball coaches. He also has a daughter, maybe a year or 3 older than mine. He's told me how he and her mother disagree whether she should be able to see certain R-rated movies. I did not mention how my daughter, at age 13, used the C word in a. Here's the thing. Retrieving the New York Times from its blue hot dog bun of a bag is the first task I undertake each morning when I leave the house to commence my workday. The one where I instruct 140 plus students on the most effective way to create transitions between body paragraphs. The one where I'm now a school-wide union rep responsible for updating the entire staff on contract negotiations. The one where I quiz students on vocabulary words like assiduous, diligent, and sacrosanct. I slipped the paper from its casing in order to retrieve the front section. Often, I immediately open to the editorial page, just so I can preview how I'll kickstart my revival at the gym, which columnists I look forward to reading as I pedal for 27 minutes and 27 seconds on a stationary bicycle. When the other Jeff delivers the paper in the exact slim moment I arrive home and attempt to untangle my cartilage from the string theory of the pizza universe, any hope of effectively transitioning the paragraphs of my own body vanishes. I don't know how to take my delivery guy face off and gather myself for school when the same dude who just hours earlier helped me carve party trays of extra cheeses into 24 rectangular shaped slices tosses me my morning paper. 2. When Pete, the assistant manager, urges me to concoct my first peanut butter chocolate milkshake, he chuckles and says the other Jeff, when he lost his milkshake virginity, proved an apocalyptic fiasco. Ice cream and shake mix flew around the front counter and all over Jeff's navy polo. Stickly chocolate syrup made a harrowing carpet on the floor. I am determined to avoid such calamities and pay close attention when Pete shows me, step by step, how to sculpt a milkshake that will compel our customers to exhort from their dormitories the glories of our phenomenal service, or at the very least, tweet our culinary brilliance to their part-time professors and tenured thesis advisors. I try to do exactly what Pete does, but you know, why not add just a smidgen extra syrup? A tad more peanut butter, escalate the customer's experience to a more sublime level of orgiastic ecstasy. The result, catastrophe. Peanut butter sprays my face, chocolate syrup stripes my eyebrows, ice cream erupts, paints half the store and all of me. The floor is an Arctic tundra, the milkshake machine a newly formed glacier. I mount a sled and harness a troop of snarling huskies, and I Iditarod race in quest of paper towels, rags, my hat, my shirt, anything that can stem the incipient ice age from layering the continent. Pete collapses in the stock market crash of laughter. You Jeffs, he says, you're all alike. Yeah, so, you know, I remember that poem fondly because Jeff was a good guy. I would have never met him if I didn't take that job. I haven't seen him since then. I imagine he's still delivering my paper, but I'm not up at 5 in the morning to retrieve it anymore most days. So we had kind of a bond there, making those pizzas in the middle of the night. All right, second poem is formal verse, which are a few examples in the book. I'm thinking in this time where technology is so important, like this event that we're doing now, and as a teacher, all my lessons are now obviously online and all my interactions with students. So I'm totally dependent on the technology actually functioning correctly all the time. And that's not usually what happens. So this is just about how messed up things can be when one small thing in your day is not working properly or isn't the way it's supposed to be. It's called Who Stole the Remote, and it is a villanelle. You want to believe your students respect you enough not to snicker and watch you squirm through the hour. You want the crime solved without having to get rough. Your desk, a disaster, crowded with ill-tempered, uncorrallable stuff still. Who is bold enough to rifle through this symbolic seat of power? You want to believe your students respect you enough. Is it the sneaky boy in the corner? The kid in the hoodie all buff? The dude on the couch cringing and shy like a delicate flower? You want the crime solved without having to get rough. Behind their watery faces, are they all laughing as you huff and you puff? Mocking as you try to teach villanelles from your ivory tower? You want to believe your students respect you enough. If you say you'll summon the principal, will they chortle, call your bluff? The atmosphere, your rapport, the whole day is growing sour. You want the crime solved without having to get rough. Come on, you're a wrestler. You know how to be tough. What a bummer to have to stand up here, mutter and glower. You want to believe your students respect you enough. You want the crime solved without having to get rough.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
That was so great. Next up, we've got Cindy Hunter Morgan reading from Harborless. Oh, hold on, Cindy, you're muted.
There, in my life, all right. So this poem, many of the poems in this book are titled after the name of a ship, the year it went down, and the body of water in which it went down. This poem is titled Omar D. Conger. The Omar D. Conger was docked in Port Huron, Michigan. It was a passenger ferry. It made frequent runs between Sarnia and Port Huron. And so it was docked right in town when the boiler exploded. And when the boiler exploded, the whole boat was blown to pieces and everything went up, and including a 200-pound radiator. And when the radiator came down, it came down through the roof and then through the ceiling of the Falk undertaking parlor during a funeral service. So I have to tell you that that part is true because that would seem otherwise imagined. Omar D. Conger, 1922, Black River. Some said the radiator was a message from God, which caused more than a few arguments. Even among those who believed in a radiant God capable of flinging a heater through a funeral parlor, there were some who said the coming of the radiator was an expression of God's solidarity with those who grieved, and some who said the coming was the beginning of an 11th plague. Whether it was wrath or sympathy, darkness or radiance, hardly made sense to others who claimed it was only coincidence. But even some who favored coincidence came to feel differently about the word. They heard only coincide, which they mouthed silently to themselves, slipping in occasional variations. Homicide, suicide, genocide, so many sides. For them, the lexicon had changed. A word was redefined by tragedy. And in certain families in Port Huron, some smoldering remnant of that day lives in the language of those who survived the survivors. For them, every coincidence is a kind of death. And then I'll read another one that is one of 6 poems sort of scattered throughout the book titled Deckhand Something Theory, Deckhand Color Theory, Deckhand Dream Theory, Deckhand Scent Theory. This is Deckhand Word Theory. And in this, you'll hear me play with two words, two verbs, collide and sync. Deckhand Word Theory. All of those vocabulary tests in school meant nothing. Everything was indeterminate. Take collide, those two L's parallel. But no, not parallel. That is the problem. Parallel only in word, not world, not fog, not gale. In the lake, direct impact, violent crash, hard sea, moment of contact. Ide, a chemical made up of two or more elements, evidence of a binary world. Floating versus not floating. Ide, end of pride, end of aid. Take sink, no, not the water basin attached to a wall, porcelain noun. Not even the infinite infinitives, to descend, to weaken, to disappoint, to drill, to dig, to defeat. Those constructions can't get this right. Listen to the S, air going out of an inflatable raft. Think about in water, in ice. Reconnect the S. Sink comes after sin. Hear the K, hard sound, caw of gulls circling a wreck.
Cindy, you are so good. You are so good. Thank you. Brian, last but not least, Brian, this is you. And I was just telling Brian before this started, this collection is one, when I was rereading sort of things getting ready for this, it's one that has, actually all three of them, just deeper meaning in what's going on in the world today. So Brian, take it away.
All right, thanks very much. This poem is called Distant Lover #2. And as you know, the book is called Come See About Me, Marvin. So Distant Lover is one of his songs. And this is Distant Lover #2. There are actually 7 distant lovers in the book. Dear Marvin, come see about me. Long way from home, cold out here. No palm trees, citrus fruit, no 80-degree days or benches made of sand. And the stores are out of space heaters. My winter soup is just a recipe written on note cards. Alarm rings in the morning, I do not move. Robert Hayden needs to wake his father from his slumber. Lumber is needed, though it ain't Sunday. Come see about me, Marvin. Did I tell you I'm lonely? My mother came here once. It was May and still cold. She isn't afraid of anything but the chill crawled up her spine like snakes scarfing for food. My mother always been afraid of snakes. Can't blame this on Harvey Fuqua. Can't blame this on Barry Gordy. Can't blame this on my awful singing voice. If only I could sing, I might feel warmer. Buy me a hip home on Outer Drive in Detroit. Get a fire started and invite some singing football players over to make a classic. Come see about me, Marvin. Take me to your old haunts. Take me to LA or Hawaii. Hurry, I'm in trouble, man. I am one of the sensitive people. Need to be wanted, didn't you hear? My lady left me out here in the cold like a deer lost near an interstate. Please come show me the way home. I'm pretty sure I don't know how to get there anymore. And this one here is the poem that's inspired by Stevie Wonder. Today is Stevie Wonder's 70th birthday, so I think it was appropriate to read this piece, and he did spend some time in Lansing. So this is Living for the City for Stevie Wonder. At the Lansing School for the Blind, the boarded up buildings do the talking. People here living just enough, like a boy named Stevelin from Saginaw, who arrived here half famous, mouth organ near his fingertips, singing Christmas songs way before this became the front line. Pastime Paradise, Ted Hall with his own terrible sight, showing the boy how to walk straight lines that he will need when he makes music down in the Motor City. Don't want to bore you with the morning sun, because lately these streets aren't happy or lovely. No one is calling to say they love anything either. This is in need of love today. The parks, storefront churches with barely any members, houses welcoming squatters and rats. There is no joy inside tears. Everyone around here would move to Saturn if they could. Be there always. This no ordinary pain, no ordinary pain. Knocking many off of their feet in this village ghetto land that hasn't done nothing in a very long time.
Thank you, Brian. That's God. Yes. So thank you. Fantastic. So audience with us, this is the time, whatever questions you have, I'm going to ask about 3 questions of them, things I've never actually asked them myself, which I was just really curious about as we talked about this approach. So I know I see writers out there. I see maybe people interested in writing. So feel free to get in on the conversation and use this opportunity to talk with these great poets, or to figure out what you want to work on next too. So my first question really begins with this idea of thematic, a thematic collection. And for all 3 of you, was that your original intention as you started to just write sort of poem by poem, or was it something that kind of organically happened? Did you know it would be thematic? Did it kind of end up being that way? That's what I'm really curious about. So I'm hoping you can talk about that a little bit.
We should go first. Me? But I would say my approach was, all my books have been kind of thematic, but I would say on this one, since I moved to Michigan to work here, I was interested in writing about Michigan and the Midwest and everything, and it just was kind of interesting. I wrote an essay called Letter from Lansing. It's an essay, and it was about going to the workers' rally where they turned it into a right to work state. And it was very interesting to just experience something that I would never see in DC. DC, you would never see anything like that. So I eventually began to think of ways to, just express what I saw. And I think, but one thing they talk about writing, since this is kind of like talking about writing too, one thing they talk about writing is the way in. Any writer will tell you that, especially screenwriters. I studied under a screenwriter once, and he said, well, you have to figure out a way in, right? You might have a great story swirling in your head, but you have to get in. And the first poem I read tonight was kind of like my way in, because that became the vehicle, which was, I'm just going to have a conversation with Marvin Gaye, who came to the Midwest when he was a teenager to be a singer, to figure out what he wanted to do. He had been in the service, and he had done a few other things, but he came out here, and I just felt like I connected with Marvin Gaye. He's from DC, I was from DC, and I read the great biography about him, Divided Soul, and then I just did a little bit of research, and then I just began to turn those things over in my head. But the book is not about that at all, really. As I said many times to many people, distant lover is one of the big themes in the book. And the distant lover is a lot of different things. So that's just up for the reader it could be most anything. But for me, the distant lover is a lot of things. And that's where I just took off from. I just began to just explore it that way. And even when I went to other places in the Midwest, it became the same thing. This notion of, what am I doing here? Why am I here? And, you know, and basically it's always cold. What the hell is going on? I mean, that's kind of like what it was, because it's always cold, even in this. It's cold today. It's May. You know what I mean? So that's my take on where it was. I won't say it just happened, but I would say, like, I was trying to figure it out, and then it happened, so to speak.
That notion of the way in, I think, is significant. Andrea Barrett, a novelist, has a great essay called The Sea of Information. And in that essay, she writes about the way in. And for her, the way in to emotion, to all emotion, is through facts. So a lot of her novels have a lot of history in them. She does a lot of research for her novels. And that's her way into emotion and to character. It's through facts, and I felt that too. I did a lot of research for this project, and I was always looking for, like, I was like a prospector with my pick and my pan, you know, like looking for the vein, looking for the spark, looking for the flash, looking for that little nugget that would give me the way into a poem. And the little nuggets were often fact-based, anecdote-based. It was the 200-pound radiator that comes through the ceiling of a funeral parlor. They were facts. That was my way in. So I think that's a really important notion, that way in. But for me, yes, I knew it would be a project. There's 6,000 wrecks at the bottom of the lake, so it was actually hard to, I mean, I could have kept going. It could have been a 6,000-page book. I'm sure Annie would have loved that.
No.
But it was also like the topic that at the time for me burned hottest. It was, and I think you have to follow that. Like, what's burning hottest? You have to follow that. And it was a topic that appealed to me naturally. I grew up in Michigan, grew up swimming in the lakes. My great-grandfather sailed, he worked on a U.S. Corps Engineers tug. He sailed the lakes to earn money so that he could send my grandma to college. That's how he earned the money. So it felt like something I was naturally curious about too.
I would say, I want to quote Brian to start here. It's always cold. What am I doing here? What the hell is going on? This is kind of how I felt at 3 a.m. washing dishes in the back room of the pizza shop, which was not heated. So I'd be wearing, you know, my polo shirt, and it'd be maybe 35, 40 degrees in there. I'd be washing dishes for an hour or two and getting soaked because the water's splashing up from the sink and everything. So I'm getting even colder. And I did not start out thinking about writing a thematic poetry collection. I don't even think I started out thinking about writing a poetry collection at all. I was working on a young adult novel about high school field hockey players. And what happened is that in the middle of the night, you know, I think Cindy just talked about 6,000 wrecks at the bottom of Lake Michigan. I feel like there's like at least 6,000 wrecks up in the middle of the night ordering pizza in the city of Ann Arbor. So I'm out there meeting them and just trying to figure out how to survive, really. When I knew that if I get home at 4:30, I'm going back to school at 7:30, and you know, how do you get through this? So I just really started writing poems for myself as a way of kind of documenting this experience, thinking about what it was like, and trying to understand it. And I'm really serious about the question of, like, what am I doing here? What the hell is going on? This was exactly what I was feeling. 50 years old. I don't want to say I was at the top of my field as a teacher, but I've won several awards for teaching. I think I do a pretty decent job. And I'm out there in the middle of the night, you know, delivering pizzas and washing dishes. So I just like, okay, I have to figure out how to navigate this for my own sanity. And so a lot of the writing I did was about, okay, what happened tonight that's interesting enough for me to reflect on, for me to think about, and then to create some kind of art out of it. So in terms of like the collection holds together because it's about these two different worlds, the world of teaching and the world of pizza. And those are two interesting worlds to traffic in, but I think thematically it's about, you know, the nature of work, whether that's emotional work, and I'm taking my cue here from Philip Levine, the great, you know, Michigan poet. What does it mean to be working? And I think that that's a question I'm asking myself now too, because my nature of work has changed so much as I'm sitting at home, you know, communicating with my students via email. I wanted to really understand, what does it mean to be out there delivering pizzas, to be going to school the next day, to be trying to like get students to learn something. And so the theme, I think, that runs through the whole collection is just, what is important work? How do you know when it's important work? And how do you do work that maybe sometimes doesn't even feel important? And how do you make it important? So I think I didn't start out trying to write any of that, but I think that's what emerged.
It's great. Those are great answers. How to weigh in. That's right. So one of the things sometimes when I'm reading collections that are more thematically based, maybe, or look thematically based, is that there are a lot of pitfalls to sort of that category, which is, you know, sometimes they can become only one note, meaning there is no up and down, there is no ride that you take. It just feels like the same poem sort of over again. Or sometimes it can become a little too cutesy. And I don't mean to put down anybody by saying that, but it's just, there are a lot of pitfalls when you're doing something like that. So I'm kind of wondering, how did you navigate that as you put your collection together? I mean, I'm assuming there were poems that you left out because they didn't feel right, or it didn't add to the sort of direction the collection was going. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
I'll go ahead. So what I wanted to do, I tried to do in a lot of my books, is try to just insist upon variety in form and things like that. I don't have anything against Western forms or anything like those traditional forms, but I wanted to incorporate the African American forms and experiences in the work. Like there are a couple blues poems in there, straight blues pieces in there. There are a couple poems in there with a lot of rhymes and things like that in there. There's poetry in there, I think, where I'm trying to use the language, how people talk normally on the streets of a city, where you might be talking to a person, as opposed to trying to be extremely pretty and things like that. Don't have anything against that. I mean, I was just putting together my collection so somebody else can go with the direction they want to. And the other thing is, I have a piece in there that's like called a sermon, and that's also out of the whole African-American experience. But I sought to like avoid those pitfalls by having short poems, long pieces. I did have like maybe like 2 haikus in there. I have a form in there called a skinny, which was invented by an African-American poet named Truth Thomas. A lot of people are starting to pick up on that form now. So that was my main thing. And then what you said at the end was important too, because I did have some poems that I decided to push out. I decided to push those poems out because they just didn't, it kind of like had to be tight, because I wanted it to maintain that theme that I was hitting at. The big thing with me was, once I was set on that title, I felt like I should try to stay with that. And Motown, the music thing is just huge here in Michigan, not just Detroit, but just all around the state. So that was the thing that I kind of focused on as well when I was pulling it all together. And I think it, for the most part, I was satisfied.
Jeff or Cindy?
Well, I'll say for me, one thing that comes up a lot in class with my students is, I'll have a student, maybe she's had a difficult time with eating issues, and she'll write 6 or 7 poems about the eating disorder. And then week number 8, she'll say, I don't know what else to write about. I'm tired. I feel like I always write about the same thing. And my answer will be, if that's what's occupying your mind and calling to you, then that's what you need to be writing. People write entire books that are hundreds of pages about one subject, right? So I've never really felt like, oh, watch out, you're gonna have too many pizza poems or too many school teaching poems in here, because I know that my experiences as a teacher, I'm gonna have an incredible variety of moments throughout every school year, some of them tragic, some of them funny, some of them confounding, and then it won't be just the same poem over and over. And in terms of the pizza experience, for me, that was a world of learning something new every day, whether it was failing to make a milkshake properly, or failing to take a phone order properly, or not knowing how to do the dishes in the back room, or missing someone's house in the middle of the night and not knowing how to locate them. I was constantly learning. And so as a writer, I feel like if I'm learning something new in a given experience, then the reader will be learning something new too. So I wasn't really too worried about, oh, these poems are going to be repetitive. They're going to be boring after a while. It just wasn't a concern.
Yeah, I think I sometimes did have some. It wasn't concerned. I think it was awareness. I think I was aware that unity was not an issue, that I needed to fan that project out, and I needed to make sure that I was always, fanning things out, so that when a reader comes to each poem, it's a new experience. So I handled that in some ways with the deckhand poems, which are sprinkled through and give the reader a kind of imaginary character to follow through the course of the book. I did it formally. There's a pantoum in there. There's another poem in there that I sort of played a game. I wrote the poem first, and then I made a game for myself and said, okay, from this poem, I will create 4 erasures. And I made rules, like I can only use each word once. I can't rearrange the order of the words. So when you see that poem in the book, if it were printed on transparent, if it were on vellum or transparent paper, what you would see is that when you push them all together, they would line up and form that original poem. But I do think, Jeff, you said I wasn't worried about having too many pizza poems or too many teaching poems, because each one was an act of discovery for you, and the reader would feel that too. I think I felt that way too when I was thinking about all of these individuals, imagined individuals, confronting the possibility of death, and realizing that we all in our own lives have different moments where we confront that possibility to varying degrees of probability, right? Like we all are confronted the near certainty of it at some point, but that's part of being human. And so it's one of those abstractions that as long as you're dealing with it specifically, hopefully we don't tire of it, because it's an endless, it's an abstraction that doesn't ever leave our lives, really. It's ever present. And other abstractions too, the fear of erasure or solitude or terror or dread, all of these things which are emotions in the book, I tried to deal with in more specific ways so that it didn't feel like each poem was the same poem.
One of the things that is really difficult, I think, for poets, and honestly, almost every writer I think I've worked with, are endings, and how to end. What story do you end with? What poem do you end with? How do you want, beginning and ends is always really interesting, how they do it. But I wanted to talk and ask you about your approach to how you knew the collection was done, how you chose what you did to end your sort of collection with, and what kind of, just kind of, did you have an approach to it? It was, all three of them are so different. And Brian, you end with an ellipses. So as if a continuation is happening. And Jeff, you end with choose bliss as sort of this last phrase that I just kind of love. And Cindy, you end with that deckhand again, and that deckhand who's sort of been our guide throughout this book, and you read from it today. So I'm just wondering how you saw that, and what kind of your intentions were, or what your thoughts were with how you end a collection.
I always tell my students when they're thinking about individual poems, because the same is true for an individual poem. That can be a challenge. What's your end game? How do you exit? We talked about the way in, but what's the way out? And so I always tell students, if you can't figure that exit out, think about either ending with a kind of musicality, something that hums and vibrates musically, that continues to resonate, or think about ending with an image. And I guess I took my own advice for that, for the finish to that poem, and then the finish to the collection, which actually ends with both. It ends with the caw of a gull circling a wreck. So you hear something and you see something. There's so it does end with image. And I think that can be a good exit strategy.
Jeff or Brian?
I would say on my end, it was just, I kind of knew that was the last poem, but the reason why those ellipses there is because there were a couple other Distant Lover pieces, but I decided to cut it off at 7. They went up to about 11. So, but I always knew that poem in some way was going to be the last poem, because it kind of summarized most of the themes that were in the book in a lot of different ways. So it was no trouble on that end with me. It was just a matter of should I include these other ones, and then if I included them, the numbers would be totally out, because that was number 7. Then it would be like number 7, and those behind it seemed to go before it. So I said I'm just going to end it with 7 and pull those out, and that was the artistic decision that I made.
I think this was actually crucial in my book. And let me take off my cottage in hat for a moment and tip it to Annie, because Annie was the one who helped me choose the final poem with those last 2 words, choose bliss. And that was hugely important. There's a pretty natural arc to this book, because there's a school year, right? So it's navigating from September through June, which means you're going through the winter, you're going through the first semester, second semester. And so I had kind of imagined the poems kind of working like that. And if you read the book, you'll see a lot of the earlier poems are like day 6 of the school year, or seeing students back from the summer. And then in the middle of the book, there's a kind of, you move toward the winter and things are getting colder. And there's a poem during the Christmas holidays or Christmas Eve when I was working. And then, in the end, it kind of gets to warmer climb, and, sort of the other thing that happened was that the way the poems work, and I didn't think about this initially, but the way the poems work is that most of the early poems, the worlds of teaching and of pizza are pretty separate. So there's like a teaching poem, pizza poem, teaching poem, pizza poem. But as the book moves on, those 2 worlds begin to intersect a lot more, right? And so the last poem in the book, with those words, choose bliss, ending it, is actually one of the heaviest poems in the book. And I had it actually starting the book originally. And Annie said, because the title is Another School Year, Another Email. And it's sort of like, this is what hits you at the beginning of the school year. But Annie suggested, well, let's make this the next year, like the year kind of after the whole pizza experience is done. And I think that actually works really well, because one thing I was really cognizant of in this book is I did not want the book to be perceived as, here's a teacher whining about, not getting paid enough. And so, oh yeah, he doesn't work in the summers, and, he gets done at 3:30, and come on, like, why is this guy whining so much about, not making enough money? So I really tried to like paint the picture of the life without sort of directly addressing those questions, except, a couple moments. And I wanted to find light in the experience. I wanted to find hope. And so these last words, which really for me as a teacher, are words that I think are the most important advice I can give my students, which is just, get through this, be happy. This time that we're in now, which is just brutal for everybody, figure out a way to smile and get through it, like survive, choose the thing that feels like it's going to make you satisfied and content and happy. And so I love that idea that the last two words in the book are choose bliss. Because as tough as that year was, I didn't want it to knock me out. My buddy Kevin is here right now, and he's going through a real difficult time. And the thing that like makes me like psyched every day is how he's getting up every day and like fighting through his illness and out there like putting boxing gloves on and like punching a fence and like believing that there's a way through, right? So yeah, choose bliss, that's how I want to end the book. Thank you, Andy, for helping me with that.
Jeff, I forgot about that. Oh, yeah. Totally forgot about that. But I will take full credit for it. But it was there. A lot of times with poetry, everything's there. When you're too close to it, sometimes it's just that one move a poem needs, and then it gets in. We have some great audience questions that I want to throw at you guys. First question we got was they're curious about how much you read other poets and are influenced by them. So have at it. I think I know the answer to this one, but can you guys talk about who's your influence, who you read?
Sure. I read other poets constantly. Some of the people that have really influenced me a lot are Patricia Smith, Philip Levine, like I said earlier. I love Jim Daniels out of Detroit, Patrick Rosal, Ross Gay. These are all writers that, I think they're incredible. Dinesh Smith. And then students of mine, I love to read students who just write their first poem. And there's a poem in my collection based on a student's poem, right? And I think, I get inspired by them all the time. And like, they have incredible ideas and they make me think about things. So, another former student, Autumn Choi Wild, just came out with a new book called Cut to Bloom. Love that one. I don't know. Any poet that I can get my hands on, mostly contemporary poets, I'd read all poetry all the time.
Cindy, Brian?
Yeah, all the time. I don't think we can be writers without being readers, and so that's how we begin our writing life, really. But it's always a tough question because there's 5,327 poets I forget to mention, but Austin Smith, Carolyn Forche, Michael McGriff, Jim Daniels. Dinesh Smith. He's sort of, I don't know, he's in, newer in the scene, but he is writing really socially important, culturally relevant, well-crafted work that thinks about themes that many are thinking about now: identity and identity politics. But he's addressing, again, something that's an abstraction and bringing craft to it. And I really admire his work.
Yeah, only thing I could say to that is I definitely read a lot of poets all the time. A lot of them influence me, have influenced me, but also read a lot of other stuff too, to try to just push myself outside my safe zone, things like that. I am reading things like Amy Cesaire's Notebook over and over again. I would definitely recommend anybody to read books like that who take you out of your boundaries. Patrick Modiano, the great fiction writer. I mean, they don't write anything like I've ever written, so it's a challenge for me to even figure out what they're trying to do. And I think that's where I want to be. I don't want to be in a safe zone ever. So once I feel safe, I feel like I always look at it like that thing Tiger Woods used to say. He was doing well, and then he said, I'm going to change my swing. And everybody said, well, why would you want to change your swing? So that's kind of like how I look at it. You know, I don't ever want to think like I have it figured out. I just want to say, like, I just want to get outside my safe zone.
Love that. Another question we have is, what advice do you have for writing narrative poems in specific forms? Do you have any advice?
I think I did that a couple times in this collection. And, you know, sometimes people kind of frown on narrative poetry. I was a fiction writer way before I was a poet. So, you know, I love narrative poems. I think they can be self-indulgent if they're just sort of like telling a story that there doesn't seem to be anything that the reader can connect to. So I think that's probably more important than anything else. Like the form can be a vehicle to help you if you kind of get to that nugget in the story that someone else can attach themselves to, right? So the way I tell my students is like, you know, if you're writing about what you've been part of, what you've witnessed, what you've seen, what is the so what for anyone else, right? And if you can make that come through in a narrative, in a form, then that works. I have in the book, there's a poem called Ghazal, Wrong City Ghazal, which in a ghazal, you're not really supposed to have even be narrative in the strictest version of the form. But for me, that particular story that I was trying to tell was so chaotic and so confusing to me that when I tried to write it in free verse, it just wasn't going anywhere. And when I wrote it in a form, that pushed me because it felt like I was trying to take control of a situation that was uncontrollable through the form. And I think that made it work better. Like it created a tension there for like, okay, this situation is bewildering. The form makes me believe I can somehow muster some control of it. So I think if you have that kind of story to tell, maybe the form can be really good because you can't find a way to rein in the elements of the story just by telling the story. So maybe the form can rein it in a little bit for you. I'm thinking also of a poem that I like to teach called Buddy's Pantoum by Leslie Newman, which is about a person dying from HIV/AIDS who has to make the decision about whether or not to stay on life support. And that is such a chaotic moment. Like, how can you make that decision in your life, right? And she wrote that in a form, and I think that's what makes the poem great, because it's impossible to make a decision like that. And then to control it with a form allows that tension to come through, I think. So I don't know, I guess that's my answer.
Cindy or Brian, don't feel like you have to answer.
I just think that notion of containing the uncontainable is significant. But you know, you have to play around and figure out what works. And with poetry, anything goes, but not everything works.
And sometimes you have to try it to say it's shit. That's really good advice I got from Lanford Wilson once, which was sometimes the whole process is about revision, and nothing is ever perfect the first time you write it. you have to put yourself out there and to try things, and it's okay if it doesn't work. That's the whole point. Literature is living, breathing. So in 5 years, I'm going to bet all 3 of these panelists will want to change something about their, I bet they already did when it came out, because it's constantly changing and evolving. They're changing as people, they're changing as writers. It's life goes on. This is you know, kind of the point. Okay, one last question. It's for Jeff, but I thought it was really interesting. How do you add your sense of gravity to seemingly commonplace objects? A shake, a paper, a splatter of chocolate.
Well, the famous poet William Carlos Williams was once asked, you know, how do you get your ideas? And he very famously said, no ideas but in things, right? And this is one of the premier lessons I try to teach my students, which is, look, you could try to write about grief or loss and just sort of attack it by writing about the idea of grief or loss, or you could write about when you went to visit your mother's house and she opened the front door so you could put your coat away and you smelled your grandfather's old coat in the closet. And that brought back everything meaningful to you about your grandfather who's no longer with you, right? So I think for me, I almost always start with some kind of really small object or moment, and that is where the gravity is, right? The gravity is not in my thoughts about what it means to be working, but the gravity is in somebody like tapping me on the door when I pull in and say, oh, thanks for my pizza, and it wasn't their pizza. And they just like fooled the pizza guy. And I gave away a pizza to the wrong person. And like, that is such a breach of the social contract, right? That pizza was supposed to go from me to the person who ordered it. Someone else just scammed and took it. Like that's where the gravity is. So I think as a writer, more than anything, probably what I try to think of myself is kind of like an above ground archaeologist, right? So like, if I see something interesting, I'm trying to dig underneath and see what it means. But it always has to start with that thing that's interesting, as opposed to just like, let me make meaning, right? There has to be a crack in the sidewalk. There has to be, you know, somebody pulling their shirt off when I deliver a pizza. There has to be, you know, the shape of the pizza itself as it comes out of the oven. So that's where I just get my inspiration in the first place. So of course, there's going to be gravity to it if I dig underneath it and try to understand what it means, I guess.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, this has been really great. Thank you, audience, for participating. I'm reminding you that 40% off on books, free domestic shipping, code READ. It's in the chat if you want to look it up. Feel free. All 3 of these wonderful poets have books available. I also want to remind you that next Wednesday, we're doing another kind of virtual roundtable discussion on writing through grief. And that's looking at memoirs and how that's been used. So feel free to come back. And then on the May 27th, we've got a fiction writing about finding your community and how you can use that to help your writing and your fiction writing. Thank you, Cindy Hunter Morgan. Thank you, Jeff Kass. Thank you, Brian Gilmore. You are all fabulous. Thank you for trusting Wayne State with your books. And Jeff, if I can steal from you, in this difficult time, I hope you all choose bliss. And we'll see you next Wednesday, hopefully. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, everyone, for coming.